Right, and I think related to that, one of the things that IT needs to do is really decide what is important to them. What are the things that are critical to that organization that they really do need to control versus what are the things that are enablers and really any solution will do. So if I choose one application to book flights versus another application to book flights, that's very different than the ERP system we're using. So IT really need to move from being an enabler for everything to really focusing on what are the critical, unique differentiators for their organization. I was talking to a CIO of a very traditional company, and they have shifted entirely to the cloud for the stuff that isn't critical to their business. So they've moved to saying, let's just leverage the best of the internet for all the stuff that isn't unique to our environment, and then really focus our attention and our controls and our policies on the parts that are unique to our business and that are critical differentiators. So it's a different way of seeing their job and seeing their responsibilities. And I think as a result, this particular CIO said they've saved a lot of money. They've found it very refreshing that they're no longer responsible for all of these miscellaneous applications that really weren't critical to the business, and they're able to focus on the stuff that's unique to their business.
And what's interesting is that mobility may very well end up being the catalyst to drive a very fundamental set of IT change that arguably IT needs to go through anyways, but it's just that mobile is such an unstoppable wave. It forces that type of change. It forces you to move faster. It forces you to expand your reach and really make a decision on what's critical internally and what's not.
Yeah, I think that moving faster is going to be a theme we're going to hear throughout the day. Barbara, to your example though, I mean, when you have productivity savings, there are two things you can do with it. You can either divest it and kind of reduce in force, or you can reinvest it. I mean, where are you seeing are you seeing now we're at a point where IT is now beginning to reinvest? If they're focusing on what they want to do, are they able to kind of reinvest those savings, or are they still
I think it's a mix. I think they are very challenged from a budget perspective. So I think we're seeing some where they're still struggling with how do we justify the expense that we absolutely need. I think there are others who are kind of through that, through the bottom of their budgetary challenges and are kind of coming up the other side. I think as a result, you're beginning to see more adoption of new technologies. We've seen organizations that are now embracing buying pads for particular communities of users. So we're seeing where they are valuing this level of investment and enabling, whereas 2 years ago would have been, well, yeah, that's a great idea, but I can't afford it. So I think they're seeing what they can do differently. So I wouldn't say it's that there's more money to spend, but they're seeing ways of spending that money differently so that it really does empower their user community.
I mean, I think the other aspect, just purely from a productivity perspective, so if you're a large, say, consumer goods company, and you have 10,000 drivers every day, stocking the shelves of your nearest grocery store with product, and all of a sudden, each of these drivers has a mobile app that tells him or her what his next stop is, et cetera, et cetera. You start getting some pretty interesting data as a large organization. Imagine 10,000 drivers every day making on an average 5 to 7 stops a day. Now, you have digital breadcrumbs, GPS data, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, the entire organization starts operating on data as opposed to just gut, right? Are these 10,000 drivers productive? Yeah. Do you have any data? No. I mean, we've been productive. We've always delivered what Walmart needed or Kroger needed, right? But now you start essentially instrumenting your entire organization with mobile, right? So I mean, if those of you who've been around for a long time, Walmart with supply chain and retail link, right? The thing that they did between Walmart and Procter & Gamble, getting visibility into their supply chain using point-of-sale data. Now imagine you have mobile endpoints, and you can get tremendous amounts of data. So essentially what you're doing is instrumenting your entire organization, right? So that's kind of step one. Step two is what do you do with that data? So that's kind of the next problem.
Second order effect.
Yeah.
Just Barbara was mentioning about cost. So has your experience been with your client base when they are starting to revisit their policies and bringing in kind of a new bring your own, say, policy? What kind of is there a net increase in cost, or is it cost flat, or I mean, certainly, how do you start to contain the costs?
So I think that the general question is when you start bringing in this new set of mobility, what actually happens to your costs? Does it go up here? Does it go down here? I think it's too early to tell, honestly, in a lot of ways. And what I've seen that's interesting is that there's some unforeseen effects, which are always the ones you don't expect in advance. So certainly there's a set of companies out there that are going the bring your own device route. And one of the drivers, aside from user demand, has been they're saying, hey, I can get out of the business of a whole bunch of capital costs to buy equipment because the user is going to go do it anyway. So maybe there's a cost advantage there. On the converse of that, though, what a lot of the analyst community has been really concerned about is what is the actual eventual help desk impact of that. So yeah, up front, maybe my cost is less, but if my device set expands, what does that mean for the applications I build and how I support them? And I will tell you that, and I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to wait and see what the answer to that ends up being. But there's a really interesting anecdote that I ran into the other day. And what it was one of our customers had deployed a whole bunch of iPads to their users. And they were anxious, pins and needles, that suddenly their help desk call volume was going to spike up. And each call, as everyone here knows, costs a lot of money. And what they found is that it didn't. And they were almost puzzled why after deploying 5,000 iPads, which was new technology to them and most of their users, didn't their costs go up? And their assumption on this one, and we'll see if that's the case or not, is one is the user was certainly more technically savvy, able to handle some of their own issues better, but that the fundamental thing that had changed with mobile versus the laptop is that the help desk had become the last resort instead of the first resort. Right? So before I let IT touch my iPad, I'm going to actually invest the 20 minutes to figure out what's wrong with it. Right? And is that a long-term trend that we see in other companies? I don't know. I think if we have this discussion a year from today, a lot of customers will have a little bit better guidance on what their overall cost expenditure was.
How about September 26th? That's mobilize.
All right, September 26th, we'll get some data.
Yeah, that's certainly
Barbara,
consistent with what we've seen in our mobile
So you have the
workforce
mobile
report.
workforce report.
Same thing, that they're saying they will try much harder to sort things out for themselves, and that they do see IT as the last resort. But the devices themselves have changed. You can't get in as much trouble with an iPad as you can if you start messing around with a Windows machine. You go near the registry on a Windows machine, and then you better bring gifts when you go to IT after that. Whereas on these newer devices, you're not going to do the same level of potential damage in trying to sort out your issues for yourself.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm poor, battered IT, right? IT as last resort is good news, bad news for me.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So in a way, there's consumerization of IT, and then as you're hinting at a kind of an ITization of the consumer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're used to fixing your own device, the help desk becomes the last resort as opposed to the first resort when you're kind of issued a corporate BlackBerry.
But one other thing to think about that might drive this exactly the opposite direction is what happens when you really have fragmentation in the enterprise. So initially, if we look back a couple of years, most US enterprises had a lot of BlackBerry, right? It was very well defined, so forth. iOS came in, an iPad is an iPad is an iPad, it doesn't really matter what country I'm in and what I'm doing, right? So it is a new platform, but it is a singular, relatively controlled platform. Now we've got a lot of folks who are looking at Android, and one of the things that they wrestle with is, am I going to take on one device or am I going to take on 20 devices? Is it one operating system? Is it 10 operating systems? And so on the policy infrastructure side, one of the really important things that's going to need to happen within IT is for IT to set a little bit of a boundary on what their litmus test is for how broad they go with device choice. Is it literally I go into the operator store, I can buy anything I want and bring it in? That is probably going to kill me from the help desk side. So that next set of policies, I think, is going to be important to figure out over the long term what the cost ratio is of having devices come in from the user community.
Mm-hmm.